Hello, and welcome to this week's discussion on language diversity and language difference. Here are some of the vocabulary that we're going to be looking at this week. And while we take a minute to consider this slide, I want you to think about your own personal experiences about diversity in your educational setting, diversity in your workplace, diversity in your neighborhood, and how that compares to perhaps your earlier experiences in life, whether it was your childhood or early workplace, or perhaps you lived in a different part of the country and perhaps your experiences were different there. How has and is our country changing in terms of the diversity that we see around us? What we know, in fact, is that our country is growing incredibly when it comes to the diversity of languages and ethnic groups that we see represented within our nation. And there are many people for whom English is not their sole or primary language of their home. The varieties of cultures, ethnicities, language experiences that are being shared in our communities is changing our educational environments, our workplace environments, and our community environments. And we have to be actively making sure that our own understanding of the contributions of this rich ethnic and cultural and linguistic neighborhood and environment brings to the actual structure of our communications and our language. So we talk about multiculturalism, and in the Justice and Riedel Communication Science and Disorders textbook that you've been reading, she pulls the definition from a 2012 book from Battle, and it says this term is used to describe a society in which people from diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic groups, age groups, geographic areas, and other variables come together to create a mosaic composed of individuals that form a rich whole. And I think she points out in the text how this is different than the melting pot that we used to describe our nation as, but more of a mosaic, and that everything is blended. So instead of cultures coming here and now we create sort of a neutral shared understanding, now we each bring our own rich piece to the mosaic, to the picture of what our nation is, each contributing vitally and creatively to the ongoing evolution of what our communication system looks like. I was thinking recently about how even in our technology, we're having to make sure that we are open and ready to communicate with others of different languages, and how Google Translate and translation apps are available so readily on our phones, whether it be a Samsung or an iPhone, that these opportunities to communicate without this language barrier are so present now, far greater than they ever were in the past, that we have the ability to cross into communication with people who don't even share our common language, is really remarkable when you think about where we're at in terms of this generation. So how do we build a cultural competence? And it is important as speech language pathologists, as speech language pathology assistants, that we build an understanding of cultural competence within our work environments, within our educational settings, because we set the standard, right, for communications amongst each other in a respectful, meaningful way, so that we are respectful of people's culture, language, ethnicity, and that we help others in our environment build this cultural competence. We have to learn to respect and acknowledge. I think and acknowledge is one of the first things. You have to understand and realize that someone might come from a different cultural background. then respect comes with that. And that once you see it, you acknowledge it, you recognize it, then respecting those cultural differences within the work environment, within the educational setting, takes purposeful concentration, because it takes practice to study and learn. If we're going to respect cultural differences, we first have to know what they are. So we have to study and learn about the backgrounds of those around us, whether it's in our neighborhood, in our educational or work settings, particularly with our clients and families, making sure that our own biases don't hinder our ability to help that family communicate effectively with their loved one who may be our client. We want to build on the strengths and experiences of the families that we're working with. So there's some foundational principles that, again, Laura Justice points out in her book, that I think are really key as we start thinking about cultural competence. Ethnocentrism is that idea that whatever culture you've been brought up in, whatever ethnicity that you've been brought up with, that a person from that culture thinks that this is the right way. I see what other people are doing. I hear what other people are doing. And they'll say out loud, I respect that, but this is the right way of doing things. And that's very ethnocentric or egocentric to think that there's not more than one right way of doing things. Cultural relativism is that understanding that, recognizing, acknowledging, but then also seeing validity in someone else's manner of communicating, in someone else's manner of getting a task done, completing something that you might feel you're doing it correctly, but recognizing that that's just as valid, that's just as accurate as the way I've been trained or thought of doing it. Note your own cultural tendencies, that kind of look amongst yourselves. Take that introspective look and say, what patterns of behavior, what values do I hold simply because I'm a member of this culture, this ethnic group, this socioeconomic status? What patterns of behavior and values do I hold as important? And realize through that cultural relativism that other patterns of behavior and values are equally valid. Be careful about stereotyping. We see someone from a particular country, from a particular ethnicity, culture, who speaks another language, and then we tend to think, well, all people from that, whatever shared background it is, share those same patterns of behavior and values, and that wouldn't be correct any more than it would be to take two students from this class and say, based off of the fact that you are sharing this course, therefore your patterns of behavior and values should be the same. That wouldn't be any more correct to do it that way either, right? So we have to be very careful about being stereotyping our families and our clients and even those in our work communities. We have environmental influences. We've talked about this over the last few weeks, where we've talked about children are born ready to speak the language of their environment. Children are exposed to the phonetic system of their future culture. Even in utero, they can hear. They're sort of pre-wired to speak the language of their birth. Then there's they actually have a sort of opened table, a blank slate in a bit of thinking when they first are born, but quickly neural pruning happens so that they selectively become attuned to the language, dialect, accent, behaviors of their culture, their environment, their language. So there is a lot of environmental influences that impact our language, behaviors, how we value certain language behaviors, how we accept certain language behaviors. My apologies for the screaming cat. As far as dialect goes, there's going to be two words here that I want you to be able to distinguish between dialect and accent. A dialect is when you take one language and there are different forms of that language that vary slightly, and usually or traditionally it's based off of geography, so by region, but realize dialects can also be socially bound, ethnically bound, and so there's interactions there. You might use somebody who might switch or code switch their dialect, might use one dialect in their social family setting, and they might use an entirely different dialect of that same language in their workplace setting. So there's a familial expectancy that they would use the dialect of their home when they're in that social setting, but then the more formal register of work, they can kick in and use the other dialect in that same language. Understand that dialects are considered linguistically correct. So if a person speaks Vietnamese American or what we've traditionally called Black English, African American English, that the rules that guide how that dialect is spoken, so for morphology, the grammar, the syntax, the word order, and the word choice, the semantics, and even the pragmatics that go along with it, are considered correct. That is a form of the language that varies slightly from the national language, but in that region, social group, ethnicity group, or ethnic group, the social situation, that grammar is expected to be used in that environment, and it is considered correct. It is not something that we treat or fix as speech language pathologists. We respect that that is a acceptable dialect. Dialects may sound a little bit different than the way we pronounce things, but it is not that's not what we base a dialect on. A dialect uses different words, different word order, different grammar, not just varied pronunciations. When we talk about pronunciation differences, we're actually talking about accents. And so this is a characteristic of speech that's based off of variations of pronunciation, not of grammar, morphology, pragmatics, and syntax. So if the language itself stays the same, and we're not talking about differences in dialect, but the pronunciation is different, then that is an accent. And accents typically vary by region. So the English that is spoken in Britain is different than the English spoken in South Africa, which is different than the English spoken in Boston, which is different than the English that is spoken here in Arizona. So those are accents. There are 7 major influences on how language dialects emerge, and so you can also understand that these same major influences are the environments where they may vary. So a person who is code switching, who can move from one dialect to another, might move based off of any one of these things. It is also how these dialects develop is based off of these things also. And that's race and ethnicity, social class, education and occupation, region of the country, gender, situation or context, peer groups, and primary language of the community. So let's take some examples of this. In Louisiana, there is a big influence of French Creole, of Hispanic cultures. And so the dialect that you hear of English in that region of the country uses different words, different morphology, different word choice, and different syntax that represents those influences. The origin of the proper English, what we call the Queen's English, that dialect of even within the country of England, the Queen's English, that dialect was actually developed as a social class division. It was a created dialect specifically to point out those in the upper social class of that nation. And so hence the Queen's English is how that began. And it is simply one of the many dialects that is spoken in that country. Peer group influences. It can be peers by your workplace, peers by neighborhood. Certainly teenagers will use their own word choice, sometimes grammar, and in a particular region of the country that might be more pronounced. Perhaps say in Watts, you might hear a different dialect than you might hear in central Missouri. Regional dialects are very common and probably one of the ones that you mostly think about when you're talking about language changes. And this map just kind of gives a quick overview of where you might see some regional differences in how language is used. Certainly in Hawaii, there is the impact of Pidgin, and they use Pidgin as their own native language, but it is a derivative of the Hawaiian language mixed with English that is spoken there. Certainly vocabulary choices, word order choices, that dialect is pronounced in that area. There are social cultural dialects. They're not a product of biology, so it doesn't matter what your genetics is. It matters more of the neighborhood that you grew up in, the people that were your neighbors, your community of social interaction will impact your dialect. Again, we have to be really culturally sensitive and not make these stereotypical assumptions, however, that just because you know of a particular social or cultural group that a person belongs to, that you would make the assumption that they share all of the characteristics, including dialect of that group. That would be an incorrect assumption. So let's move and transition to talk about what it's like to be bilingual, or what does it mean to be bilingual. And the word bi meaning two and lingual meaning language. It's essentially speaking two languages. When we say someone is a polyglot, we say they are speaking more than two languages. And again, as our nation changes, more and more frequently we see people who come into environments where we're working with communication deficits of people who speak more than one language. Brain injury happens, I think it's indiscriminate, right? It happens regardless of how many languages you speak. And so we need to know the background of our clients so that we can better help them manage which language has survived the best after a brain injury and help them work through that. Children that come to us from multicultural homes, perhaps at home they speak Urdu, Farsi, English, and Romanian, and they're exposed to all of those languages. We have to be respectful and understand that that's the influence on our client, and just help. We would need to understand that their acquisition of the language of education might take a little longer when they've had this broad background of the first 4 years of their life with this variety of languages. So what do we call it when someone is learning two languages at the same time? We call them simultaneous language learners. And that's the environment, and we'll use bilingualism for the example, where parents may speak both Spanish and English to their child simultaneously. In some families, one parent will choose to speak Spanish, the other parent will choose to speak English, and they speak them with an equal balance to the child. A successive language learner will have a primary language. That's the language they spoke first. It's the language that's predominant in their home. And then they add the second language typically once they enter the school system. We call these children English language learners, or ELL. We get asked a lot, if a child has a disability such as Down syndrome, a learning disability, is it too difficult for that child to learn another language? So should the family speak just one language? And our answer to that is no. It does not adversely affect cognitive development. In fact, it strengthens it in the typical child. It strengthens language usage in the child who has developmental delays. Also, they may take longer to acquire both languages, but they are perfectly capable of doing so should they have the prerequisite skills to learn language. What we know about the typically developing child is that bilingual children actually have better metalinguistic skills than monolingual children. That's that ability to think about speech sounds, to think about word order, to think about morphology. And that makes sense, doesn't it? When you're having to kind of decide which words do I use with which person, which order do I put these words in, which words go together and which ones don't. You are already using metalinguistics, so it makes perfect sense that the bilingual child is typically developing has stronger metalinguistic skills. Things that affect the rate and accuracy of the second language acquisition, and we're talking here about the sequential language learner, the one who has this primary home language, and then they come to school to learn and they learn the secondary language. Very often we see this in cultures that have communities. So let's say there's an Albanian community. You may experience that everyone in that community speaks their home language of Albanian, and so therefore they have very little exposure to that secondary language. Or Vietnamese in a community where there's a strong population of people from that same cultural group, perhaps they're exposed mostly to Vietnamese and they get less exposure to that other language, and therefore language isn't learned as well. I can use a personal experience here. I spent some time in Africa, and instead of enrolling me at a typical grade school, I was enrolled in the English grade school. I did not learn the language, even though I was there for 2 years, I did not learn the language of the community. And that makes sense, right? Because I was being limited in the exposure to the alternate language. And through immersion, I might have learned a little bit more. What we all know also affects the rate and acquisition of the second language is that the home and cultural social environments are different. So all of those things that impact and influence dialect, accent, social customs also impact the acquisition of the second language, because now we're having to deal with all of the pieces that are different about the second language, including social customs, the pragmatic, the unspoken social rules that go with the language, the expectations and cultural expectations. Some homes where they have a primary language, not all the family members speak the secondary language. Some of them don't value or put like the same emphasis on the secondary language, and whereas some value it greatly, and it really just depends on the home. One is not right or wrong, it is just different. Sometimes other members of the family, while they think they are bilingual or they think they have mastered that second language, they perhaps have not mastered it in a quality enough to expose the child to the correct grammar and syntax. So perhaps it's a parent who speaks both Spanish and English, or speaks both French and English, and they think their English is quality because they're being understood, but it's a broken quality of English, and then therefore that's the model for the child, and their model is inadequate, and so they don't learn the language as quickly as they could. Attending preschool or a bilingual preschool can help a child learn a second language because they're not waiting till kindergarten. So if they just get in there a little bit earlier, as they're still mastering the basics of language, sometimes we see, again, a little bit better of a speed up for how quickly it helps them learn the second language. Some generalities, and this isn't true for everyone, but just understand when we say generalities, we mean in general. Children learn their primary language from their home environment and they learn it well. Remember, 46 months old, they've mastered the basics of their primary language. Children often enter school with very limited exposure. So that simultaneous language learner is not as common as the sequential language learner. We know that when children are immersed into a secondary language environment, that they often will go through what we call a quiet phase or a silent phase while they're learning some new vocabulary, new syntax. It takes them a while before they'll start using the language themselves, but they are learning it by listening. General rule of thumb is it takes up to about 4 years for them to master the social language and about 7 years before they master the language of academics. We see the influence of that first language onto the acquisition of the second language because they're imposing the same word order rules or grammar rules that they have from the primary language onto the second one. We see this silent period where the child isn't doing any talking, or when they're talking, it's very little. Often we see children at this stage of the game referred for a speech and language evaluation. And again, we have to be cognizant and aware of what our child's background is because we're in a little bit of a position here. The child is in a silent period as they're learning the second language, right? So we can't assume that they don't have mastery of their primary language. It would require a conversation with the parents to ask, how are they doing in their primary language? Let's ask that question first. On the other hand, we can't simply assume that a child doesn't have an impairment simply because they're bilingual or they are learning a second language. Just because a person is bilingual doesn't mean they aren't language impaired. So there's a little bit of a catch-22 there, and a dynamic assessment where we're talking to families, where we're looking at the siblings' development, or looking at the overall experiences of the child, that they learn over time, that they're acquiring new words at a regular pace. Those are things that we're going to be looking at when we get this referral for the child that is talking less because this is their exposure to the second language. Again, so just extreme caution. We have to be careful that we don't judge a child's academic performance simply because of the impact of multicultural, multilanguage differences in the same way we wouldn't want to label someone as a speech and language impairment when they are in the process of acquiring more than one language because we've tested them or assessed them in the second language. So we have to be respectful and do whatever attempts we can at the dynamic assessment to assess their language in their primary language, or assess their language skills or communication skills in their primary language. Not as easily done as said. We have to take accents into account, realize children also are influenced by the accent of their family. So if a person comes from, say, a culture where R's and L's aren't produced, it wouldn't be necessarily appropriate to then try and treat R and L in that child when the parents of the home don't use those phonemes, or the phonemes don't appear in their native language. We'd have to be respectful of that. The same would go true for morphology, making sure that we understand the morphology, the grammar rules of another language. And again, I just want to reiterate, but just because the child's learning a second language doesn't preclude them from being speech and language impaired. And a really good, thorough diagnosis is what's important, with a really taking the time to see that the child is learning, so we can give them a bit of a intervention where we teach them something. uh, we we test it, we teach them, and then we test it again. And did they learn? Did they learn it? So we give them I'll repeat that. We give them a quick assessment on a skill that we're going to teach them, and maybe it's vocabulary knowledge, and then we give them a little bit of instruction on it, and then we test it again. Did they learn? Were they able to learn in that kind of a setting? Then chances are they're developing and learning typically. And we know for speech and language impaired children, they don't learn typically. They are atypical in their communicative development. And so that would be a sign there that the child is actually learning appropriately. But that's for the speech pathologist to decide. But I just want you to be aware as SLPAs that you too can help in the process of making sure that we're really being respectful and cognizant of children's backgrounds and making sure we get the full story. All right, that's it for this evening, and I hope you have a great night.